It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Leon, I'm Irwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza, good morning.
Hello, Irwin. Good morning to you.
Thank you very much. There we do. There we are again, letting our audience know that we seem to record in the morning. That's
Yeah,
how we
we've
fly
gotten
here.
into this habit. It's all good. I mean, at times we would do a happy hour. That would be fine too. We could
Yeah.
just pretend we
Uh,
could be having martinis right now and it's 10 o'clock in the
we,
morning.
we, we could do that also, or I could just get a can of beer and pop it open into the
There
microphone
you
and let
go.
our
There you
audience hear
go.
that. But Esperanza, this is really, boy, it's an overused term on our Hamptons, but I continue to say stuff like this. What a crazy story this one is. You
Yeah,
know,
well, this area, I just always wonder, we think we're so special here. Maybe other places have crazy stories like this. I'm sure they do, but we're so East Hampton centric.
exactly.
But
I
it
think
really
that.
does feel very, very unique to this place.
So Esperanza, 40 years ago in 1985, the town of East Hampton, there was a referendum to purchase 431 and a half acres of the former Grace estate. That's W.R. Grace. We all don't have to get into who he was. The former Grace estate for $6.3 million, owned by a developer and a renowned art dealer, art collector, Ben Heller, who owned this property. Esperanza and I were talking earlier before we went on air. Ben Heller can and should be an episode all unto himself because he's had a long storied history within the town and as an art collector. But anyway, Esperanza.
Let me say, just interject here, specifically an art collector of modern art is, and specifically abstract expressionism in
which,
particular. So,
which is,
this Springs being the cradle, one of, of abstract
yes.
expressionism. Yeah.
And yeah, and we've touched on it on many a prior podcast now about in our Hamptons, the ABEX movement and everything else. So it's going to be a natural tie-in. But right now, we're talking about the acquisition of the Grace estate, and subsequently, we're going to get back also into the acquisition of the other enormous parcel that Ben Heller owned, which was 341 acres of Barcelona, which are, let's call it, in the same neighborhood,
Oh
Esperanza.
gosh, yeah, you can see
I
one
mean,
from
it's
the other,
yeah,
and interestingly, all of this happened in this mid '80s time frame. A real sort of, ooh, what do you call it? Almost like you could call it a tipping point or potential tipping point for the town. And fortunately, with this story, the outcome was different and more positive than it could have been. Well, it
thousand
depends on
percent.
your perspective, I guess.
Yes, correct. And that's what part of what we're going to get into because again, I mean, Ben Heller, this was in round numbers 772 acres that he controlled and he and his partners and wanted to develop into something. And, we'll get into that as we go along. But if we imagine development on these 772 acres, suffice to say, Esperanza, uh, again, something we've said on numerous occasions discussing parallel sort of situations, this would have been a very different place. Had the town not purchased this, the same way had the town not purchased the Atlantic Double Dunes, or had the development that the Bell Estate wanted to originally do. All of these things, come into play. But by the same token, 6.3 million dollars for this 431 acres. Yes, in today's 40 years later, wow, what a bargain.
Yeah.
But at the time, it wasn't such a bargain. Now,
And and not such a bargain because this was really, it wasn't, this was pre community preservation funds.
That's
This
correct.
wasn't the county chipping in money.
That's
This
correct.
wasn't the state chipping in money for Grace Estate anyway. This was thus the referendum fully taxpayer money.
That's rendered speechless, but that's exactly correct. I mean, so this was all
This was a
taxpayer
big
money.
deal.
Yeah, and $6.3 million in 1985 terms is a lot different than $6.3 million in 2025 terms. I mean, so we have to really, think about that.
Yes.
Okay, and that's sort of where this story goes. Now, the supervisor at the time was Judith Hope, familiar name to many of us out here. She felt this purchase would be, as she termed it, an environmental bargain. And she was supported by the executive director of the Long Island Regional Planning Board, Lee Koppelman. His legacy is very well known, particularly on the East End. And Koppelman also viewed the proposal, and I quote, it represents the best possible deal from an environmental point of view as well as the point of view of owners' rights. Now, John Courtney, there's always another side, East Hampton Planning Board member. He forced the Saturday's referendum because he believed that Mr. Heller outmaneuvered the town in these negotiations. He felt Heller was really ramming the deal down the throats of the town without really consulting the public. And, Esperanza Courtney didn't view this purchase at all. Now, here's that other side of the story, right? I mean, 2/3 of the acreage that the town would buy was going to be a controlled preserve, really reserved primarily for educational outings. The remaining third would be open for passive recreational uses. They're making out this purchase as an opportunity to grab some parkland for East Hampton, Courtney said. And Courtney felt this wasn't his idea of parkland.
Right. Well, what is a park, right? I don't think they were saying it was all park. That's the main
Right,
thing to
exactly.
look at. We're talking open space. We're talking keeping this pristine area, which let's not forget to emphasize that this is on a Northwest Harbor,
That's right.
and it was a very precious area for the baymen, for scallops, and had a lot of old trails that led to that, those fishing areas, in other words, for
To,
generations.
to your exact point, a negotiator for the town, a man by the name of Russell Hoflich. He was also the local executive director of the Nature Conservancy. Now, the Nature Conservancy is a private foundation. They buy land all over the country for preservation, but he points out really exactly what you were saying, Esperanza. It's all about preserving the environmental integrity of the land. Playing a numbers game with units and cluster housing and whatnot does not accomplish what Judith Hope, her supporters, and the Nature Conservancy really wanted, which was the environmental integrity of the land. Once it's developed, even if it's a smaller development, it's still developed, Esperanza, right?
Right, right. Even if, I mean, I think they had enacted a moratorium. They
Right,
upzoned from, up to 5-acre lots, I
right.
think it was. Regardless, you clear, you take away a whole lot of environmental protection to what
Yes.
it was at the time a clean harbor and a very, sensitive natural area.
And Lee Koppelman chiming in, talking specifically about the clustering of any kind of housing units. I'm familiar with the clustering proposal, Koppelman said. To your point, to Mr. Hofflick's point, but clustering won't maximize the environmental protection of the estate in the way the proposed agreement will. And again, it becomes, I mean, there's one way to do it, there's another way to do it. You either preserve or you don't. And this was an enormous swath of land.
Yeah, which
And
Mr. Heller had planned not only to develop with homes, but also a golf course and stables and
yes,
a riding academy. And from what I've read in a book by of recollections by Deborah Foster, even creating artificial ponds,
right.
taking out the woodlands and putting lawns and creating artificial koi ponds, koi fish, really, really appropriately indigenous to the area. I'm very sarcastic there.
We the sarcasm is duly noted. Yes, thank you. We, but it's, and again, we're talking, they were talking about 212 units of housing here. 30 units would be built there under an agreement to be voted on. But
On the
again,
shoreline.
on the shoreline, on the shoreline. But, and I think this is really a salient point to bring across, Esperanza. You know, Most importantly, the Grace Estate
Oh wait,
would
sorry,
help.
sorry. Let
Oh,
me
yes,
let me just say.
please.
So it was 212 units that were originally to be clustered along the shoreline. 212.
That's correct.
I want
That's
that to
correct.
sink in.
That's
Now,
correct.
with the agreement that was to be voted on in the referendum, only 30 units would
Right.
be built from 212 to 30.
And all development would be subject to town board approval, town board management committee of government leaders, environmental leaders to thrash out all of these details. Again, but most importantly, the Grace Estate, and I think this is almost really sort of the bigger picture here. It was about the whole master land preservation plan for the area. Remember, we had Mashomack, Cedar Point County Park, Northwest Harbor County Park, portion of Little Northwest Creek, all really in that same real geographic area.
Yeah, yeah, like a radius. Yeah, yeah.
Correct. Correct. So that's where it was. And now we're going to fast forward it, a few years, to 92. And we're getting this information. These are two New York Times stories, and we're going to go somewhere with this. How there was ultimately a settlement. And we're going to talk now about the other slab of land, Barcelona Neck, again, Esperanza
Right,
adjacent
right.
to.
And I'm sorry, Irwin. I'm just gonna we're fast forwarding to 1992. Let's just say that
Yes,
for
please
the
tie it in
Grace
for us,
estate,
Esperanza.
the referendum was handily won in
Yes,
favor of the purchase of the Grace estate quite favorably. The the local residents voted for this purchase in favor of it. What you're talking about now is the settlement that took place with regard to the purchase by the state of Barcelona Neck.
thank you, Esperanza. And to your Esperanza's point, yes. We need a voice of reason on this podcast, and we need someone to really sort of bring it back full circle. So thank you for doing that.
Just have to, it's apples and
It,
oranges.
it is it is Apple. It's yes. It's you know how does that line go? Same corporation, different divisions, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like it's the gist of the storyline is the same, but yes, Grace Estate is separate from Barcelona. These are
Yes.
two separate things, but
But we have the same character
the
at the
same
at the center of it, who is Ben Heller.
the same cast of characters, actually, because we're going to get involved. Tony Bullock and everyone else. He was on the town board at the time. Now he was supervisor, but it was a town board member. During
With the
the
Grace
Grace Estate.
estate. Right. Yeah.
So, but these two stories, Esperanza, do tie in together, right? Because if we go now to Barcelona Neck, okay, and in 92 there was an out of court settlement. The state agreed to pay Ben Heller $40 million for his 341 acres at Barcelona Neck. Are we good with that so far?
40
Right.
million for 341 acres that
That
he
Ben
had
Heller,
paid
right? Please,
5.9
right.
for.
So 5.9 million. Now, obviously, critics of this settlement, $117,000 an acre. Okay. Kathy Lester, a member of the town board, quoted as saying she was in shock and disbelief. It's going to affect every acquisition on the East End, make it difficult for anyone to consider making a purchase of open land. Okay. Tony Bullock, the supervisor at the time, remember, town board member under Judith Hope during the Grace Estate, now town supervisor. He also used the term shock and disbelief. The settlement would give Mr. Heller 11 times more per acre than the town was offering for adjacent waterfront property that Heller also owned.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. In other words, setting a poor precedent.
Exactly right. Now, interestingly, how did Ben Heller feel about the time? Now, you would think on paper, holy cow,
Yeah, this looks
11,
pretty good on paper, but he
11
felt cheated.
cheated. Let me see if I could channel my inner Ben Heller. I'm extraordinarily bitter. I'm filled with rage. I slept like a doll up to the settlement. I was shocked, but I will have my day in court.
So it's a different kind of shock and disbelief on his end.
Apparently, apparently, you know,
I
you
love
know,
this. I slept like a doll up to the settlement. Oh my gosh.
I haven't slept like a doll
But
in
what I
years,
love the
Esperanza.
most,
Yes.
and I mean,
Please,
this
please
is
say it. I
very
want you to
much
say it.
worthy of a whole episode devoted to Mr. Heller. But the fact that he believed that the settlement was a bargain for the state, and he was so angry with town officials, he was going to leave this area. He was just fed up. I'll no longer be a part of this confrontational community.
And I do believe, and
Well,
again,
good riddance, sir.
and we'll save this for an episode on Ben Heller, but I do actually believe he did move. But
He moved to Sharon, Connecticut.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, where probably it wasn't as much of a land of no. I don't know.
maybe not. I mean, that's Northwest can who knows. But again, Barcelona, we should really give a brief background on Barcelona. It's been uninhabited for centuries. There was one house on its tip, named by 17th century sailors who found the high cliffs overlooking Northwest Harbor, reminiscent of the highlands above Barcelona. It's
Right.
pretty cool.
And as Irwin and I were talking just before the episode, it's also known as Russell's Neck, which name, maybe that's the house at its tip, but I don't know the origins of it. I didn't get a chance to look that up. But
Yeah.
yeah, I've always been intrigued by the name Barcelona Neck,
Yes.
and then to know that this is the reason, because I figured it had to
Yeah.
have an association, right?
You would certainly think. And again, Ben Heller, he bought this property with the idea, of building. Again, this is
It's like Mid Hamptons, it's like Carl
what?
Fisher, it's like every other
Thank
story that we talk
thank you.
about. We want to build luxury housing, a golf course, we want to build condominiums, we want to bring more people, cluster a lot of luxury into one beautiful natural space.
How many times do we say thematically the story is so familiar to us, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's
Yes.
obvious, it's familiar.
And it's not unique to this area. I know that, but
That's
yes.
that's also, completely true. But again, to a point we made earlier, remember this property also lay between two huge waterfront tracts that were owned by the state and the county
That
already.
were
So
already owned. Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
right.
So it
So
made sense as the last piece of the puzzle.
yeah, exactly. And Ben Heller sued the town for $114 million. Lawyer for the town at the time, said they should have tried the case. They would have found out that Heller's appraisal was ludicrous. Kathy Lester weighing in. I don't know where their minds were. This isn't even waterfront. There are environmental constraints on it. It's hilly, severe topography. State officials were even surprised. Langdon Marsh, the deputy commissioner of the New York State DEC, quoted as saying at the time, not an outcome anybody expected. But again, this acquisition of this property did create a 1,000 acres, state and county park for hikers, horseback riders, views over Northwest Harbor into Sag Harbor. Shelter Island could be seen. And One thing Langdon Marsh from the DEC did say, and it's an important, really an important piece to mention, it's one of the finest assemblages of open space in the entire state, which again is saying something. Esperanza, I just thought of this one. I mean, was talking 40 years later, right? To say something like this in a place that has such severe development pressures,
Yeah.
looking at it now, 40 years later, we have one of the finest assemblages of open space here. It's
What
a lot different than having a great assemblage of open space upstate where land values are much lower. This
right.
was pretty
This is
significant.
significant. Yes, very significant. And I will point out also, as many probably know, there there is, as it turns out, a golf course here.
Ironies of ironies,
It
right?
is it is a public golf course.
Right.
It's very natural. It's very, not what do you would call it? Not a fancy golf course, and
Correct.
it's a public one, as I said. So, but the irony is that yes, ultimately there is a golf course here.
Right. Exactly. I'm glad you brought that out because that is completely true. And again, now, after the deal was done, Tony Bullock, town supervisor, not impressed. Again, we don't know what his take would be now. Maybe now he'd say, wow, in retrospect, it was a bargain. Who knows? No one can say. I mean, he was acting in the town's interest at the moment. But at the time, he wasn't impressed. The settlement represented $30 million in profit for Heller. Obscene, he said, especially since it's taxpayers' money. But of course, Ben Heller did see things differently. And Ben Heller said at the time, it was a $6 million purchase price, and my costs were higher than the first price. They just about busted me. They ruined my life for a decade and that of my family. My life was ruined and interfered with drastically. There wasn't a day for 10 years when I didn't have internal writhing and wrangling multiple times a day.
Ah,
Well,
he's dramatic. He was very dramatic. Yeah.
it is pretty dramatic. And I mean, but of course, if we're talking about a sum of money like this, public money, um, it's not something to be taken lightly. I mean, there's going to be agonizing negotiations in something like this.
Right, right.
So
Well,
I mean,
he
I
would
don't
have
know
had a
what his
much
expect.
easier time just, saying, oh, let's negotiate a nice deal that, this will be preserved for the community for years to come, and I'll be known as a preservationist. Wouldn't that have been nice?
It really, yeah, and it really would have been. And again, that will be a conversation for another day when Esperanza and I always talk about future possible podcasts and talking about philanthropy, talking about Heller's relationship with
Maybe,
it in the art
yeah,
world.
maybe Irwin, maybe you're just more remembered when you're not the preservationist. Is that possible? I mean, how
It's
many names of people do we really know who have just outright given land to the town or to Peconic Land Trust or, just for conservation, preservation? How many names do we know?
it's a really fantastic point.
And then does it matter, right?
I know your question's rather rhetorical, but it's a great question. And Esperanza, it's really something you and I should certainly delve deeper on in a future podcast because,
Yes.
you know, philanthropy. Here we are brainstorming about a future podcast during a podcast, but that's okay. I don't think our audience will mind. But like talking about that, Esperanza, philanthropy versus development versus preservation, everything is intertwined. And it would be really a fascinating dialogue that we really need to have
Yeah, for
in the near
sure.
future. So, but, Esperanza, in October of 2005, excuse me, the East Hampton Star, great article by Joanne Pilgrim, um, who wrote a sort of a retrospective marking 20 years of Grace Estate, how and why a huge tract of Northwest Woods was preserved. And it's sort of interesting to look at it from this vantage point. So now this article was 20 years ago, but 20 years after the fact of Grace Estate. And again, Grace Estate, Barcelona, two separate but similar, if I have that poetic license, Esperanza
Yeah, sort
situations,
of
but
neighboring across the
neighboring.
wall.
So
Yes.
yeah, the gist of it, but there was a gathering in Northwest Woods in October of '05 to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the preservation of the Grace Estate acreage, So, and again, to go over it, the land was bought after the referendum, $6.3 million in '85. The Nature Conservancy did contribute $500,000 to the cost of that. But Randall Parsons, who was an East Hampton Town board member at the time, was quoted in this article. The town was definitely at a crossroads. There were subdivision applications, and this is, I think, really what's so important and salient to look at, being as we're talking 20 years later, Esperanza. There were subdivision applications on Barcelona Neck. Okay, same. There's the tie-in. The Grace Estate, not to mention Hither Hills and Montauk. And it was the first time that people rose up and said, "This is not what we want."
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Right? Okay. There was, again, the subdivision plan, 262 lots on the Grace Estate, 140 lots on Barcelona were submitted by Ben Heller. It's 400 units of housing. Okay. That was what was before them. And with applications before the planning board, taking those two into account, but all told, with Hither Hills and everything else, 500 luxury condominiums, apartments, and houses, and the amenities you already spoke of, golf, tennis, stables. You brought up before how the Baymen's Association, very concerned about the scallop beds there. There was also a newly formed Northwest Alliance and the Committee to Save the Grace Estate. I mean, Esperanza, so much
It was a
going
big,
on
yeah,
here.
people rallied. I mean, this was, it still wasn't a done deal, with all of the people that did come together for this. There was still the question of a referendum for the Grace Estate. So,
It,
and here we are. You just, as you pointed out, this article was 20 years ago. We're at the 40-year
that's right.
anniversary this year.
That's right. And, even here in this article by Joanne Pilgrim, the East Hampton Town trustees challenged Heller's claim to trustee roads. I mean, there was a lot going on here. The politics of East Hampton, it has to be noted, Esperanza, changed. In '83, a Democratic ticket, Randall Parsons, Tony Bullock, Judith Hope, was voted in based on this pro-preservation platform, gaining the town board majority. So to your point, there was a groundswell of support for this kind of thing. Okay. They updated the comprehensive plan. There was a moratorium on large subdivisions in '84. And then the Grace Estate in Barcelona were upzoned for house lots of 5 acres. You mentioned that earlier. Ben Heller sued the town. We went into that. I mean, Esperanza. Wow. Now, eventually, the agreement was hammered out, allowing North Bay Associates, that's Heller's corporate entity, to create 30 lots on the 100 acres in the northwest portion. The adjacent 85 would be given to the town to satisfy zoning, the remaining 431 purchased publicly. Oh my God. What's going on here? Now, you were here in East Hampton at this time? Well, you were young. You were very young. I mean, you
I
couldn't
was
have remembered
very
all
young. I would
you
not
couldn't
have
have remembered all the
really
details. Yeah.
known or understood what was happening with
Right.
this,
Okay. Okay.
unfortunately. And it
Okay.
probably wasn't something necessarily that, that my parents would have had dinner conversation
Yeah,
about.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But again, to sort of wrap this up, and we should really start winding this podcast up. I mean, the voters did approve this purchase in June of '85. Barcelona was purchased by the state in '89. I mean, at the time, and again, these are conversations that continue. There was a recent roundtable discussion.
This
So
was
we're
20
going back.
years ago.
This was 20 years ago. We're talking about 2005. Frank Deline, was a builder. He was a member of the
Still,
board of the
yeah.
Long Island Builders Institute, president of Telemark Builders in Bridgehampton. He was also talking about this, suggesting, and this is sort of an ancillary, like a little with going off on a tangent here, but I think an okay tangent
Oh, it's a very timely tangent.
and a very timely tangent, even 20 years later, that the town look at its land holdings, including the Grace Estate, as areas where new hamlet centers with commerce and housing can be created. Look, it's not an 800-pound gorilla to say there is a housing crisis here if there is not enough affordable housing. So this is a conversation that can sort of tie in here. And how Mr. Deline at the time said the town should establish a priority of retaining our next generation. There has to be land where young people can purchase homes, build equity. I'm not promoting paving the Grace Estate, he said. I'm presenting a concept,
Yeah,
asking the
yeah,
asking the town to.
it's a reasonable request until he mentions um using smart growth principles, which then might make some people feel very uncomfortable, especially in a place as sensitive as this.
And you know,
Because I don't know if you know what smart growth is, but it just sounds very urban.
yeah, it's smart. Yeah, it's smart growth. Yeah, it's a sweet, nice buzzword, nice term, but yeah, is smart growth more realistic for an up island suburb or an adjacent to an urban area rather than a community such as Eastern Long Island? That's sort of, I think, the conversation here. You know, but this does sort of get, and honestly, where we're just this is just a conversation now. It's not full disclosure, full transparency to our Hamptons podcast audience. It's not on our outline. It's just sort of, as often happens here, comes about organically, but it does raise a point. Esperanza, yes, part of what we love about Eastern Long Island, especially as compared to the sprawl of more Western environs on Long Island, Nassau County, Western Suffolk County, is the open space and everything else. But there is sort of that, yeah, there's not a lot of affordable housing. How do we maintain, I'll put that rhetorically, Esperanza. How do we maintain the balance between open space acquisition and the need for affordable housing?
Right.
It's
Right.
really
It's it's
challenging.
it's a challenging question, and many would point the finger at precisely the preservation of open space as the culprit for driving up the prices of housing here. Kind of the millionaire luxury housing. But as you can see from these articles from 20, 40 years ago, even farther back, it's always been this idea of bringing luxury here, hasn't it? I mean, it's
Yes,
never this, oh, let's build a nice little neighborhood for people that can that can be affordable and can live there,
correct.
and
Cor-
have a starter home or whatever it is. It's never, you don't hear
no,
that until you hear affordable housing, which
right.
is, to me, that sounds very urban. So if we didn't have the 10,000 square foot houses, would we have this problem?
A, con-
Upzoning, is that a problem?
a
Right?
conversation we've had so many times when a developer buys that 1,100 square foot house in Northwest or Springs or wherever, and rather a developer outbids a couple that could have bought that house as a starter home and expanded it and lived here, what have you.
Mm-hmm.
But that house is then
It's
gone.
taken off the market
Take it
forever as an
forever.
affordable
Right.
house.
As an affordable rental option for young families,
Right.
as a possible starter home as a purchase price,
Correct.
because that
Correct.
1,100 square foot house is going to be removed and replaced by a 6,000 square foot house marketed to second homeowners. And boy, we really didn't, this wasn't where we planned on going, but this is how our Hamptons podcast flies. And it's sort of, there's such a natural tie in.
It
And
is because it's the extractive nature of, somebody like Ben Heller, for all the good that he may have done, for the art world or
right,
wherever
right.
else, or for his family. I'm not, we hopefully will get to that one day. Um, you know, what is that need to be so extractive of the environment and not really give back not only to, you preserving nature, because nature deserves that too, but providing affordable places to live
and
for people,
and again,
humans.
of course, look, listen, we're grateful. We live in a, at least right now, we live in a democracy, and it's a free market. And I mean, we accept and understand all of those things, and that's obviously fine.
But the free
But
market isn't free. Here, let's
yeah, well, the free market isn't free. I mean, look, and again, and look, we're not. This is not an anti-development conversation. I mean, developers are business people. They're motivated by profit. That's not a crime in this
How
country. I
much
mean,
is enough? That's
well,
the
that's
question.
now that is another question. And but to wind it back to the gist of this, so when you look back 40 years ago, and even though the Tony Bullocks and the Kathy Lesters and everyone else were so aghast at the purchase price and everything else, Esperanza, once it's gone, it's gone. And
That's right. That's
thank
right.
goodness they did step in, whatever. And again, we the Atlanta double dunes. I mean, you can go on and on and on with, oh, that was a fortune at the time. Imagine Bluff Road with that being developed. So
No, completely true. And I used, I love this quote from it was in this a book by Deb Foster, which is a story that must be told, Saving East Hampton's Soul, 1978 to 2017. And in chapter 46, which is titled, How Many of You Have Been to the Grace Estate?
right, yeah,
She quotes from a film, a 1974 film from the group of this for the South Fork regarding increasing development pressure. It's a film on that. It says, you can't miss what you never knew.
wow. I
So
swear to God, I have chills from that. That,
there,
I mean, but that Esperanza, we are running out of time.
yes,
So I'm gonna ask you one more time if you can, because you somehow when you say it, it sounds so much more poetic than me. Can you please read that line one more time for our audience?
you can't miss what you never knew.
The pause was for production effect, but
Yeah,
Esperanza, I think
that,
we leave it there.
yes, that stays with us.
That
Yes,
really stays with
let's
us.
think about that one. Thank
Esperanza,
you, Irwin.
always a pleasure.
And yes, likewise.
Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.